Hello there guys. Recently I was waiting for the primer to dry on a couple of projects that I'm working on, and I had a couple of hours to spare, so I thought I'd give a crack to this LVT2 from Rubicon Models. I picked this up back in November at Telford, and it's in 1/56 scale or 28mm scale, which is not a scale I've normally looked at. To be honest, I've somewhat dismissed it as a sort of wargaming scale, not really thinking it would have much detail or much interest to me as a scale modeler, but I'm pleased to say actually I was completely wrong. This kit cost me about £20, £21 I think it was. And as you can see, we can build the LVT2 or the LVTA2. The difference between those will be shown in the instructions in a moment. One thing I will note though, I don't think this box art here represents a version that we can build out of the box. Both of the versions in the box, as far as I'm aware, have the twin machine guns at the front, and they don't have the machine guns at the side or the rear as depicted on this vehicle. We do get a little bit of background here on the different versions of the LVT2 on the back of the box. You can pause it here if you want to read a bit more about that. But I did have a bit of a detailed look at this in my Telford video, so I'm going to move on to the instructions and then the build. So the first thing you might notice is that we only get 3 sprues with the kit. It is a nice quick build, and as I say, I actually finished the build in about 3 hours. The main differences here between the two versions are in steps 1 and 2. So you can see here on the LVT2 we have that sort of a driver's hatch panel with the 2 machine guns on top. And for the LVTA2 with the extra armour, we have a couple of extra pieces there and a slightly different driver's roof there. Basically it's a version with extra armour. As you can see from the rest of the instructions, we build up the upper hull surface there, the deck. Step 4 we build up the interior and the lower hull. 4B and 4C, not quite sure why they're not 5 and 6. We build up the left and right tracks, everything together in 4D, and then finally on the back page a few more bits and pieces to go together. And one thing you'll notice here that I didn't actually notice until right at the end when I started to follow this step is that step 5A and 5B is for building a waterline version of this. So in that case, if you were to build the waterline version, most of the kit instructions you wouldn't use, most of the parts you wouldn't use either, simply the top there, the deck, some special parts for the interior, and in fact some special parts for the sides, the sort of sponsons there as well. Anyway, moving on to the build, and you can see here that I've dry fitted everything that is required for the interior. It's a simple box, 4 separate sides, all very clearly keyed so you can get them only in the right place. And as you can see, they were fairly sturdy there even without any glue. One thing worth noting with these kits is that they are ABS plastic, so you need either a glue specifically for ABS, or you can use, as I found out, Tamiya extra thin. So of course I glued those interior pieces into position, and while the glue was drying I moved on to the running gear. Now you might notice here on these drive sockets that the teeth are really well defined on one side and they look really flat and almost broken off on the other side, and that's the same on each of these. At first I thought this was some kind of moulding issue or quality control issue, but I think it's by design. When we look at the tracks, I think basically it's to get the wheel sort of into the tracks without having to have holes for the teeth to actually go into, if you see what I mean. So it is by design, as far as I can tell. And that idea is reinforced there by the fact that when we put these wheels on, those flatter parts go towards the outside edges, the top and the rear, where the tracks will be. You can see here how the sponsons go together. 2 main pieces with some very, very clear guidance holes and pins. The tracks are lengths without the individual links, so there's only 4 lengths for each side. And again, the top one there is attached using some pins. There are tabs for the rest of them. They go around like so. It's a bit hard to hold them here in position without gluing them. And then the final piece there also has a pin to keep it in position, like so. As you might imagine, I kept those separate for painting, and that would help me paint both the tracks and the vehicle. There are a few details to go in here on this sponson before it's finished. And again, you can see there the sponsons go on using those 5 guidance pins. Lovely fit. The only major piece we're missing from this is the upper deck, which goes over the top. And there at the front on the left hand side we will have a driver's compartment piece. We've got a bit of an option here at the rear for the engine cover. The instructions don't really explain which one is which. I went for the one that looked like a radiator grille because I just thought that looked nicer. And of course there are some other details that need to go on the upper deck, like the lights and this rail at the rear, which is used to mount some machine guns. I found that with the upper hull dry fitted, I could still get the tracks into position. Just about. So I decided to glue that in place now, but obviously leave the tracks separate as I mentioned. Then it was a case of adding this rear piece, which fitted fairly well but did need taping into position just to clamp it down while the glue dried. And from the options on the first 2 steps, I went for the LVT A2, so the extra armoured version. So I followed step 2 here in the instructions. These are the machine guns. This is a single piece moulding. That tab there is to let us attach the ammunition box, like so. And then a single piece to attach for the armoured shield. That driver's cab simply drops into place, but we do need to be careful to minimise this gap here at the inside. So again, it's a case of holding this down while the glue dries, rather than letting it sort of spring back to that slightly raised position. We've got an extra bow machine gun, and although there's no interior detail, I think it's dark enough inside that hatch that I can leave this open and not be fearful of seeing plastic through there. And at that point, with the addition of the machine guns, my LVT2A is complete. So it's time to give everything a paint. Now in terms of colour schemes and decals, the box doesn't give us a lot. The instructions don't have any colour schemes in them, and on the rear we only have the simple olive drab design. But we do get a really healthy sheet of decals, as you can see on the back of the box there. We've got American stars, we've got the red cross of a medical vehicle, we've got the shark's mouth there, various code numbers and stripes and so on. But in terms of the overall paint, I think we have a couple of options. From my understanding, the LVTs were originally in a colour that's variously described as navy grey, battleship grey or ocean grey, which is a sort of slightly blue, light to mid grey colour. Now that was great for ocean camouflage, but once LVT started to be used inland, of course that wasn't a very helpful colour, and the Marines did ask then for the LVTs to be supplied from the factory in olive drab. Before that happened though, some units took the ocean grey vehicles and added some camouflage, most often with a sandy colour. Once the olive drab vehicles arrived, they were used for some time, and then the Marines started to add some camouflage to those too. And typically that was the base of olive drab with the earth red and the earth yellow added, and possibly with black added as well. So we've got a variety of schemes. We've got overall grey, grey with sand camouflage, overall olive drab, or olive drab with earth red, earth yellow and possibly black camouflage. Overall olive drab I wasn't going to do because it's just a bit plain. Initially I was going to go for the olive drab with the camo scheme, but then I remembered I did that on my Pacific Sherman a while ago and I wanted to do something a bit different, so I went for the grey scheme with the yellow camouflage. So to start off I gave the whole kit a coat of Tamiya grey primer, then did a bit of old school pre-shading with some XF69 NATO black, getting into the dark areas there, particularly around the tops of the tracks and so on. Then for my overall ocean grey I went for Tamiya Ocean Grey XF82. I'm not quite sure how this compares with the US Navy Ocean Grey, but I think it looks fairly decent for me. Then, having looked at some reference photos and thinking about this small scale, I decided to make the camo hard edged, so I used some of the Tamiya masking sheet to cut out a simple camo pattern. And the vehicles that I've seen tended to have camo patterns on the top as well as on the sides, though not in the interior. Here you can see the vehicle masked off. For my sand colour, I didn't really have anything in the AK Real colours or the Tamiya range, so I went for Vallejo model colour. This is dark sand, and with a little bit of water or thinner and some flow improver, it airbrushes perfectly well. Here you can see the result of that rather unusual camo scheme. And despite a few runs and oversprays here and there, I think it looks quite good. Detail painting was next. The machine guns were painted with a base coat of black, and once that was dry they were dry brushed with a metal colour. AK Old Wood was used for the poles on the side. And the dark grey colour for the running gear. Separately, the tracks were airbrushed in Tamiya XF84, which is dark iron. I know they're not made of iron, but I think that's a good base colour for them. Prior to the decals, I sprayed VMS gloss varnish just where the decals would go. I always have a bit of trouble spraying this VMS gloss varnish. The matte seems to go down fine, but I always end up with a strange effect on the gloss. And it's quite annoying because I used to be able to do it really well, and I don't know what I've changed, but my technique has got worse. Here's a close-up of that decal sheet that I showed you earlier. As you can see, a wide variety of options. The decals were extremely thin, and I did almost tear a couple of them just manoeuvring them into position. I ultimately went for the US star on the side, along with the double red bars to indicate Red Beach 2. Vallejo metal colour steel was then dry brushed over the machine guns, as previously mentioned, and the running gear to try and give more of a worn effect. Then it was time to clip the tracks into place, and thanks to those handy pins that I showed you earlier, it's really easy to apply them. In fact, no glue was needed for that top length there. After allowing those decals to dry for 24 hours, the entire vehicle was given a coat of VMS matte varnish. I find this much easier to spray than the gloss, and the matte effect of course gives a very nice, more realistic effect to the overall vehicle. Then one of my favourite steps, using the Abteilung 502 sepia oil paint, thinned with odourless thinner, I applied a pin wash. This provides a nice sharp contrast between the relatively light sand and ocean grey colours. And you can see as I apply it, those details really start to pop. It does look quite strong in some places here, but of course as it dries, the effect will be reduced. And of course on this particular model, we need to remember we've got the inside to weather as well. To give the paintwork a bit of a worn, faded, abused effect, I continued with the oil paints, this time with a dot filter. Here I've chosen colours which will lighten the paintwork as well as match the kind of environment that the LVT was used in. So we've got some neutral grey, we've got some dust, and we've got a little bit of white. Once the dots of this are placed all over the side of the vehicle, I can streak them in a downward motion using a brush dampened in odourless thinner. The effect is applied the same way on the front of the vehicle. But slightly differently on the horizontal surfaces on the side and the rear. In these cases I put the dots of the oil paint on and then sort of stipple them into the surface, sort of moving them towards the edge where dust and dirt might catch, but also leaving a good amount in the centre. And of course not forgetting the dirt and the grime and the wear which would occur on the interior. This time I've also added a bit of sepia oil paint to simulate that extra dirt. To try to add some wood grain to the wooden poles on the sides, I went over the base coat of Vallejo old wood with some sepia oil paint, again thinned quite heavily with that odourless thinner. I didn't want a huge amount of rust on this vehicle, but I figured a little bit streaking from the sides, particularly on these steps here, where lots of footfall would occur, could look quite nice. Surprisingly, I don't have a rust-coloured regular enamel, but I do have these rust deposits. They're basically an enamel with some texture inside them. So again, thinning with odourless thinner, it was applied very sparingly around the key areas. And of course, always in that downwards motion. Some of the reference photos showed quite a lot of mud and soil and grass churned up in the LVT's tracks. I didn't want to go quite that far, but I did want something in them. So I turned to my trusty AK dry ground texture paste. This is near the end of the pot, and as you can see it's almost dried out. I thinned it with what turned out to be a bit too much water and I added some short 4.5mm static grass in the mix, then stippled it on to the tracks. As you can see, it is a bit too thin there, and a lot of the texture has been lost. The next day, when that was dry, I took 3 Tamiya paints, XF69 Desert Yellow, XF57 Buff and XF55 Deck Tan, and moved on to the final part of the weathering, which was the dust coat. Initially I used a very thinned coat of the XF59 Desert Yellow. Being a darker colour, I applied it quite sparingly, trying to get it primarily on the tracks themselves, into some of the recesses around the running gear, with a few streaks up the side, some more streaks on the back, and for the interior, just trying to paint it in the corners where I think the heaviest dirt would accumulate. Hopefully you can just about see that there on the interior. I then took an equally heavily thinned XF57 with a couple of drops of XF55 Deck Tan, which makes it slightly more grey, and applied a bit more of a generous dust coat all around the outside and of course the inside, and into some of the recesses on the upper surface. With that, a very light dry brush of Vallejo steel on the anti-slip texture, and my LVT2 is complete. And there we go guys, that was my build of Rubicon's 1/56 scale LVT2. This was such a fun build, I was really pleasantly surprised by this. A combination of a relatively quick and simple build, but with a good amount of detail. Great engineering, everything went together really well. And an interesting subject as well. I could definitely see myself ordering something else from Rubicon in the future. In fact, if we have a look at Rubicon's website, they've got some really nice subjects here. Quite a few of these of course are available in other scales, but there are quite a few different versions as well. So even the LVT that I built here is available. I think the LVT1, the 2 that I've built, the 4 is available as well, with various different combinations of weapons and so on. So it's definitely worth exploring. Got various Shermans that you can see here. I've got that Dodge. Lots of interesting looking subjects. M113, that's a post-war one, isn't it, I think? As you can see, they do vehicles, infantry, accessory packs as well. So really something you could make a lot of use of. This video is not sponsored by them, it's just something I'm interested in. So some Bedford trucks there, Morris Quad, I've built one of those before. This has caught my eye actually. Although this is a resin kit, not a plastic kit. They're Lloyd carrier. I'm going to have to look at this in a bit more detail, I think. Very similar to the Bren gun carrier. They've got one of these in Duxford. So that's quite a cool little vehicle. And another thing I'd point out over here in the German vehicle section, this King Tiger here, Tiger B, whatever you want to call it, Tiger 2, has a full interior in 1/56 scale, which is pretty cool. Let's make that a bit bigger. That's pretty interesting, isn't it? So definitely something for everyone here, I think. There's a few things I've got my eye on, and of course the prices are relatively low compared to larger scales. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. I'd like to thank everyone for watching and give special thanks to my YouTube members and Patreon supporters who provide financial support for the channel every month. Thank you guys, it really is appreciated, and I really do enjoy the conversations that we have on both Patreon and YouTube. I will of course have a new video for you next week, and until then, thank you again for watching and have fun modelling.